The English are the only people upon earth who have been able to prescribe limits to the power of kings by resisting them. In this episode of Philosophers Explained, we continue our discussion of Voltaire's Letters on England, written while in exile. In the earlier letters, Voltaire has been praising implicitly and rhetorically liberty, toleration, and individualism in the English way of doing religion, and he now turns to praise for an analysis of the English way of doing politics, science, and philosophy. Let's go to the text. Now, moving on directly to political issues. The English Parliament are fond of comparing themselves to the old Romans, and it's an interesting point that the English take their history seriously. Of course, many people in many cultures take their history seriously, but widespread taking seriously the history of the English nation, what we can learn from Roman history, what we can learn from Greek history, has been very much a part of English Renaissance and beyond history, and admiring of these pre-Christian examples of good cultures and healthy accomplishments in civilization. But Voltaire goes on to make an interesting point, has a very strong historical claim. The civil wars of Rome ended in slavery, and those of the English in liberty. The English are the only people upon earth who have been able to prescribe limits to the power of kings by resisting them, and who by a series of struggles have at last established that wise government where the prince is all-powerful to do good and at the same time restrained from committing evil, where the nobles are great without insolence, though there are no vassals, and where the people share in the government without confusion. So somehow the English, unique around the world, have created a peaceful political system where everyone is participating, and there are various checks and limitations on the power of potential abusers. How did the English do this? If we're all interested then in peaceful society and well-regulated politics, Voltaire's suggestion is learning from the English is something that we should be doing serious. The mixture in the English government, that harmony between kings, lords, and commons did not always subsist. So here an early Republican/democratic notion that we should not have all power concentrated in one body, that we should have separations of power, and somehow that the powers can be divided and separated, and nonetheless they can be coordinated in a way to achieve a harmony. The English have done it somehow. What was that for politically curious people? English history is absolutely important. He goes back to Magna Carta some centuries earlier, and then marches through many of the significant steps from going from absolute monarchy to power being increasingly dispersed, certain amount of civil wars and tensions along the way and backsliding, but nonetheless, out of that, uniquely, the English have developed a successful political system. An egalitarian point here. No one is exempted in this country from paying certain taxes because he is a nobleman or a priest. Everybody is equally obligated to taxation. There's no hierarchy, there are no special privileges, there are no double standards. Further, all duties and taxes are settled by the House of Commons, not by the aristocrats in the House of Lords, not by the king. That power of taxation, that very powerful power that governments have, has been devolved down to the level of the commons, and it is they who in effect hold the purse strings of the nation. Then the whole nation pays, every man in proportion to his revenue or estate, not according to his title, which would be absurd. Now, politics shading onto economic matters, shading into business matters. How did the English become not only peaceful and tolerant, politically peaceful, tolerant religiously, but wealthy economically? Trade. They opened themselves up to the world. They went out into the world. They traded. As trade enriched the citizens in England, so it contributed to their freedom, and this freedom on the other side extended their commerce, whence arose the grandeur of the state. So the English way of doing politics, emphasizing liberty, emphasizing equality of rights and obligations, works hand in hand with being free traders. Both of them are mutually enriching of each other. And then the British, of course, are noted for becoming a rising sea power. Trade raised by insensible degrees the naval power, which gives the English now a superiority over the seas. Now, traders, free traders, merchants, people engaged in commerce, people who are money lenders, people who are stock exchange in traditional European culture, these people have been looked down upon by the so-called people who are higher up the social status, people who are in the clergy, people who are in the aristocracy, perhaps even people who are in the royal family, making money and doing business that is beneath our dignity. And Voltaire strikes a very modern point, suggesting that, in fact, that social hierarchy needs to be rethought and even reversed. Who actually are the people who are adding value to our society, enriching us materially, and then also because of their willingness to be tolerant and deal with people of different religions and different races and different nationalities and so forth, improving our morals. Is it people in business or is it the nobility? And there's this long striking passage here. In France, the title of Marquis is given gratis to anyone, that is to say free, who will accept it. And whoever arrives at Paris from the midst of the most remote provinces with money in his purse and a name terminating in ac or il, may strut about and cry, "Such a man as I, a man of my rank and figure," and may look down upon a trader with sovereign contempt. Oh, you people in business, you money-making people. Whilst the trader, on the other hand, on the other side, by thus often hearing his profession treated so disdainfully, is fool enough to blush at it. So even many people in business feel humiliated or ashamed that I'm just in business and so forth, and I'm not a worthy member of the aristocracy and so forth. And Voltaire says, nonsense. However, I need not say which is most useful to a nation, a lord powdered in the tip of the mode, who knows exactly at what o'clock the king rises and goes to bed, and who gives himself airs of grandeur and state. At the same time, he is acting the slave in the antechamber of a prime minister, or of a merchant who enriches his country, dispatches orders from his counting house to Surat and Grand Cairo, and contributes to the well-being of the world. We should honor people in business. They are the real deal, not these fake people who are members of the aristocracy. All right, shifting to some scientific matters, there's one very striking letter on inoculation, and Voltaire arguing that, again, we French should be able to learn from practices of other cultures, in this case English, but not only the English, with respect to one disease that had ravaged and epidemics regularly would kill thousands and thousands of people. It's a problem that is solvable, and it has been solved by foreigners, and perhaps we French should set aside our ethnically prejudicial attitudes and be open to learning from what other cultures do, particularly in cases where life and death are the stakes. It is inadvertently affirmed in the Christian countries of Europe that the English are fools and madmen. Fools because they give their children the smallpox to prevent their catching it, and madmen because they wantonly communicate a certain and dreadful distemper to their children merely to prevent an uncertain evil. So the practice of taking a small dose of smallpox or cowpox sometimes and deliberately giving it to one's children with the idea that they will get a mild version of it but then become immune to it, that just seems crazy, but the English do it. The English, on the other side, call the rest of the Europeans cowardly and unnatural. Cowardly because they are afraid of putting their children to a little pain. Unnatural because they expose them to die one time or other of the smallpox. So this is in part a scientific matter, an empirical scientific matter. Does it in fact work? That is Voltaire's question. What has been the practice in places where this inoculation has happened? Set aside our prejudices, and in many cases prejudices filtered through our traditional dislikes of members of other nations. And he mentions this woman, Lady Wortley Montagu, right, who was a great part of the bringing the smallpox vaccination to England as a result of traveling to the Middle East, to Constantinople. There it was a fairly common practice of the Circassian women, a little bit to the north, to have done inoculation specifically of their daughters. They wanted them not to be disfigured by smallpox if they survived. And they certainly didn't want them to die. Now, in this case, there's a darker part of the story. The Circassians would often sell their daughters into sexual slavery to the court in Constantinople. But nonetheless, setting that issue aside, it does seem to be the case that the inoculation worked, and there's a long-established tradition of its working. It worked there. The English learned of it there, brought it back to England, and it is working in England. So we, French people, take notice. 20,000 persons whom the smallpox swept away in Paris in 1723, just a few years ago as Voltaire is writing this, would have been alive at this time. Perhaps our nation will imitate 10 years hence this practice of the English. And then he goes on to mention this is a little more rumor mill, but that the Chinese also have been doing this. So learn from the Chinese, learn from the Circassians, learn from the results in Constantinople, learn from the English. Don't be narrow-minded and unwilling to change your traditions. Now, moving on to the philosophers and the scientists and the philosophers of silence. On the Lord Bacon, Francis Bacon, about whom we have an episode also in our Philosophers Explained series, Voltaire opens this section by raising a fascinating question. Who was the greatest man in history? And often we will play this parlor game or this party game. And we all have our own set of heroes, but most often what happens when we ask in all of history who was the most important person, it's going to be military conquerors, or it's going to be famous politicians who will be cited. And so Voltaire here gives a fairly standard list: Caesar, Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, Tamerlane, Cromwell, and so forth. Right? So all of those are military conquerors. Other people might have favorite political figures, or if you are of a more religious temperament, you might have your religious heroes, certain founders, saints, and others. Now notice what Voltaire does. Somebody answered that Sir Isaac Newton excelled them all. A scientist. This gentleman's assertion was very just. So how do we measure greatness then, Voltaire is asking? If true greatness consists in having received from heaven a mighty genius, and in having employed it to enlighten our own mind and that of others, a man like Sir Isaac Newton, whose equal is hardly found in 1,000 years, is the truly great man. So this is a very modern philosophy point. It's going to be people who have certain intellectual prowess and use that prowess for the betterment of mankind. That is the mark of greatness and of the greatest. Now consider by contrast the politicians. Those politicians and conquerors, and all ages produced some, were generally so many illustrious, wicked men. What do conquerors and politicians typically do? Well, they go to war, they conquer other people, they kill a whole bunch of people and take their stuff. Right? Why is that greatness? Well, it's a certain kind of greatness, but it's not the greatest of all greatness. That's me versus you. Might makes right in many cases. Instead, the person who is the scientist, the person of genius who discovers new knowledge and bequeaths that to us, and perhaps even more importantly, teaches us how to use our own potential for genius to think for ourselves and discover knowledge. That's going to be the greatest person. The man who claims our respect, who commands over the minds of the rest of the world by the force of truth, not those who enslave their fellow creatures. Scientists, philosophers, others who have truth and pursue truth and show us how to pursue truth, those are the people we should be admiring, not conquerors. And then he goes on to highlight three such individuals. I'll begin with Lord Bacon, Mr. Locke, John Locke, and Sir Isaac Newton, and then some others do come in for honorable mention. I shall begin with the celebrated Francis Bacon, and chronologically early 1600s, Bacon does come first. The most singular and the best of all of his pieces is his Novum Scientiarum Organum, right? The new organon, or the new tool. Bacon writing as a philosopher, but a philosopher of knowledge, and developing the methodologies for expanding our stock of knowledge that mature into the sciences, the philosopher of science. He is the father of experimental philosophy. That is to say, not philosophy that's abstract speculation, all just in sitting in your armchair spinning out theories about the world, but rather philosophy that looks at the world and does experiments on the world, and then on the basis of that gathers knowledge about the way the world actually works. It must indeed be confessed that very surprising secrets had been found out before his time. It's not that suddenly we're acquiring knowledge. There's been a lot of knowledge, but what Bacon is doing is providing a general method for the creation of new knowledge. It's an experimental method, a set of general principles, an experimental philosophy. And then suddenly, after Bacon, this takes off. In a little time, experimental philosophy began to be cultivated on a sudden in most parts of Europe. Such was Bacon's influence. And he goes on then, Voltaire, to note that Bacon was also then influential upon Isaac Newton. Would we have had Isaac Newton if it had not been for Bacon's philosophical and philosophy of science teachings? What surprised me most was to read in his work, in express terms, the new attraction, the invention of which is ascribed to Sir Isaac Newton. We must search, says Lord Bacon, whether there may not be a kind of magnetic power which operates between the earth and heavy bodies, between the moon and the ocean, between the planets, and so forth. And he goes on then to suggest, having suggested this new thing, right, or this idea of gravity, right, as a force that Newton was more famously to go on and work out the mathematics and physics for. We must say, says he, Bacon now, make an experiment to see whether the same clock will go faster on the top of a mountain or at the bottom of a mine. We might have philosophical theories about the nature of time, but what we actually need to do is put it to the experimental test. Is time uniform, or is it relative, depending on circumstance? Don't just sit in your armchair and commit to a certain theory or try to deduce it from first principles or whatever. We will start and actually do the science. Bacon, a great man. Mr. Locke, Mr. John Locke, a generation later. Perhaps no man ever had a more judicious or a more methodical genius, or was a more acute logician than Mr. Locke. And yet he was not deeply skilled in the mathematics. We also have an episode on John Locke in our Philosophers Explained series, but nonetheless, Voltaire goes on to sing his praises, and to sing his praises to the detriment of a famous French philosopher, René Descartes. Bacon and Locke are usually categorized as empiricists or experimentalists in their approach to philosophy. Descartes in a more rationalistic manner. Now, we might expect Voltaire as a Frenchman to give pride of place, of course, to a great and important French philosopher, but here he wants to argue we're actually interested in truth, and if we are interested in truth, as important as Descartes is, Bacon and Locke are better and more important. Mr. Locke has displayed the human soul in the same manner as the excellent anatomist explains the springs of the human body. So Locke, as early psychologist, when approaching the study of the mind, the soul, the spirit, consciousness, whatever we call it, in an empirical matter, again, not abstract speculations and presuming the truth of certain traditional theories. And if we have reached the limits of what we can figure out so far by doing these experimental methods, then we recognize that we have reached those limits. We don't take leaps of faith and go beyond the evidence and reasoning that it has taken us. So he does not claim that he's got it all worked out what the nature of the soul is. Instead of concluding at once what we know not, he examines gradually what we would know. He takes an infant at the instant of his birth. He traces step by step the progress of his understanding, examines what things he has in common with the beasts and what he possesses above them. Above all, he consults himself, the being conscious that he himself thinks. So we have an empirical, developmental study of the mind, of knowledge, of the human understanding, such that we ourselves can follow along those steps and verify for ourselves whether we think he's on the right track. And then when we reach the limits, I shall leave, says he, to those who know more of this matter than myself, the examining whether the soul exists before or after the organization of our bodies. So it's an open question from this empirical mindset, and we are fine with not yet having answered all possible questions, not being so hubristic or feeling that we are commanded in some sense, or as a matter of ego, to say that we have everything figured out. We know what we know. The evidence and the logic points us to this part. Next generation, they can continue to work on this problem. We must not be apprehensive that any philosophical opinion will ever prejudice the religion of a country. And so here at this point, we're worried about standard religious reactions to this new experimental philosophy, to the new sciences, taking things in a different direction, suggesting that maybe the traditional answers are wrong or perhaps need to be revised or rethought. And Voltaire then wanting to suggest, look, maybe we don't need to worry about this. We can have a division of the territory. Let people interested in religious faith believe what they want. Let the philosophers and the scientists do their good work. And he's proposing that there is a kind of dualism at work in the territory. The objects of reason and those of faith are of a very different nature. Let the scientists do the science, let the religious people do their religion. They're very different. They shouldn't be in conflict with each other. Newton was the destroyer of the Cartesian system. René Descartes, a great philosopher, but also a great early modern scientist, developed a physical system. What Voltaire wants to argue is that Newton's system is far superior. We need to abandon the Cartesian system. And again, it should not be a matter of nationalistic pride that just because we are French, we are going to accept it. It's an international scientific community that is developing here. Truth is universal. It knows no national boundaries. What made Descartes able to do his work? And one of the interesting questions is that why Descartes was not able to do his work in France. Voltaire noted that he voluntarily exiled himself for much of his career from France. He was a long time of the opinion that it would be necessary for him to fly from the country of his fellow creatures, and especially from his native country. There was not much freedom of investigation for philosophers, for scientists, not very much religious toleration. And so Descartes recognizes in order to do what he wanted to do, he has to go to a more tolerant place, which is why he ended up spending much of his career in Holland. Voltaire points to the same example, or the earlier example of Galileo, who down in Italy, still Catholic Italy, much intolerance, much suppression of free thinkers and early scientists. Galileo, at 80 years of age, was groaning in the prisons of the Inquisition. So if we're actually interested in knowledge, we're actually interested in truth, don't do what the church and the state did to Galileo. Don't do what it did, or at least that it felt Descartes made Descartes feel that he had to do what he did was mainly to leave, otherwise suffer perhaps the same fate as Galileo. Let's change our attitudes in Catholic Europe. And then he notes, Voltaire, that to England's credit, it had reformed its attitudes. That's precisely why Newton was able to do the astounding things that Newton did. The progress of Sir Isaac Newton's life was quite different. It was his peculiar felicity not only to be born in a country of liberty. So liberty is not just a religious matter. Liberty is not just an economic matter or a political matter or a sex/gender matter of liberty for women too. It is an intellectual matter. We need freedom of thought in the scientific realm if we are going to make progress. And then one more name drop mention from the letter on tragedy. Voltaire mentions Shakespeare, that giant on the literary landscape who is basically an artistic benefactor to all of humankind, another Englishman.